In this video, we will be finishing up our walkthrough of the 2015 AP Biology free response questions. Question 7. Smell perception in mammals involves the interactions of airborne odorant molecules from the environment with receptor proteins on the olfactory neurons in the nasal cavity. The binding of odorant molecules to the receptor proteins triggers action potentials in the olfactory neurons and results in transmission of information to the brain. Mammalian genomes typically have approximately 1,000 functional odorant receptor genes, each encoding a unique odorant receptor. Part A. Describe how the signal is transmitted across the synapse from an olfactory sensory neuron to the interneuron that transmits the information to the brain. So, as you can see in this picture, you can see a bunch of olfactory nerves in the nose, and each of these olfactory nerves is going to receive signals from the receptors that that bind to these odorant molecules, and that signal is going to be transmitted down that neuron and in the form of neurotransmitters, and they're going to, at the end of that neuron, those neurotransmitters are going to reach the synapse, and they are going to be taken up by the postsynaptic neuron, which basically means the neuron that is receiving those neurotransmitters from the presynaptic neuron. And that signal is just going to travel to the brain, where it will be processed like all the other signals that reach the brain. Part B. Explain how the expression of a limited number of odorant receptor genes can lead to the perception of thousands of odors. Use the evidence about the number of odorant receptor genes to support your explanation. So one possibility for how this takes place is that even though you may only have 1,000 different odorant receptor genes, let's say you only have 1,000 odorant receptors, but that doesn't mean that each of these receptors can only bind to one molecule. You can have one receptor binding to many different odorant molecules. So the mathematical combinations produced by this more than make up for the small number of genes that there are. And as a result, this is why humans can perceive thousands and thousands of odors, which is much larger than the number of genes that they have. And another reason why this might happen is because of alternative splicing. As you might recall, after a gene is transcribed, the pre-mRNA is going to be spliced by the spliceosome, and similar proteins may all be coded from a single gene, and these different forms of the protein can be created depending on which introns are removed and which exons remain. And since there are 1,000 genes, then in total, the number of scents that the nose can detect is much higher than 1,000, given that the alternative splicing has a factor in it, and also the mathematical combinations due to the fact that an odorant receptor can bind to many different molecules. Question 8. An individual has lost the ability to activate B cells and mount a humoral immune response. Part A. Propose one direct consequence of the loss of B cell activity on the individual's humoral immune response to an initial exposure to a bacterial pathogen. So, the definition of humoral immunity is the response, the component of the immune system, where antibodies are produced to prepare the body for a future attack by the same pathogen. And basically, the mechanism of how this works is you have a bunch of recently matured B cells, and they're called naive B cells because they don't really know what to do. But when they're exposed to an antigen, they become programmed to produce a particular antibody for that antigen, and they're going to become plasma cells, which are long-lived cells that can release large quantities of antibodies when the same pathogen returns, or they can become memory B cells, which circulate through the body for a long time and ensure that when the pathogen reappears, the response is going to be much faster. And so if you've got no B cells, then there's not going to be any plasma cells, and no antibodies will be produced. And that means also no memory B cells will be produced. And I listed a few possibilities there, but the question says to only propose one. So on the test, if you have a question like that, make sure you're only stating one reason why the statement is true. So part B, propose one direct consequence of the loss of B cell activity on the speed of the individual's humoral immune response to a second exposure to the bacterial pathogen. So during the first exposure, you just have these naive B cells that are exposed to the antibodies, while the cell-mediated components of the immune system, that is the T cells and the neutrophils and natural killer cells and macrophages, just kill the invading cells. So, but when a memory B cell, when memory B cells are created in response to a pathogen entering the body for the first time, this ensures that when the pathogen comes back, the second exposure, the response is going to be much faster. So if you don't have these memory B cells or plasma cells, if you don't have these cells that can release large amounts of antibodies, when an attack comes back, then the response to the second exposure is basically going to be a naive response, the same as the response to the first exposure to that pathogen. Describe one characteristic of the individual's immune response to the bacterial pathogen that is not affected by the loss of B cells. So here we have this diagram which shows many different components of the immune system, and they can generally be grouped into two parts. One is the innate immunity or cell-mediated immunity, and so these are the cells of the immune system that just find and destroy invading cells. And then the adaptive immunity, or which includes the humoral response, is the long-term slower response. So those cells that attack and destroy invading pathogens like macrophages, dendritic cells, mast cells. Well, mast cells release histamines and cytokines and other chemicals. Natural killer cells, basophils, neutrophils, etc. These are not going to be affected because they are not part of the humoral response, the adaptive immunity that B cells are part of. They're just going to keep on doing their thing, trying their best to find and destroy the invading pathogens. And they won't be really affected. Thank you for watching this video, and please like and subscribe.